He endured. He held up. He was able to hang in there. He didn't faint.
He built an empire on faith, led millions with his voice, yet in the end, it was 7 whispered words to his son that became his greatest sermon. What happened in that quiet room just days before his death shocked even his closest followers and changed everything we thought we knew about legacy, forgiveness, and the man behind the pulpit. The story of Charles Stanley isn't just one of spiritual devotion. It's a tale carved from hardship, shaped by emotional scars, and powered by an unshakable determination to find light in the darkest places. Born during the tail end of the Great Depression, his entrance into the world came with silence rather than celebration. Just 9 months in, his father was gone. No final words, no lingering memories, just a vacant chair where a father's voice should have been, and a mother suddenly carrying the crushing weight of survival alone in a collapsing economy. Rebecca, Charles's mother, eventually remarried, hoping that companionship would bring healing. But instead of comfort, she opened the door to fear. Her new husband came with demons of his own, alcohol-fueled rage that shattered their fragile household. Charles grew up watching terror unfold in his own living room. He witnessed violence no child should see. There were nights when he braced himself behind locked doors and clutched a loaded pistol under his pillow just to feel a sliver of safety. Those memories didn't just leave marks, they shaped his core. What he learned through that chaos was clear. If you're going to survive, you have to lean on something greater than yourself. For Charles, that was God. Even in childhood, Charles turned to faith not for tradition but for refuge. When the world above ground failed him, he'd sneak into the church basement, his tears echoing through the walls as he begged for peace. He cried, he screamed, he prayed like his life depended on it, because it did. Though he was raised Pentecostal, those moments of raw emotion, that burning desperation to connect with something divine, never left him, even when he transitioned to the Baptist tradition. At 17, Charles stood at a crossroads, unsure of his calling. Doubt gnawed at him. Could someone as fractured as him really speak to others about healing? That's when he visited his grandfather, one of the few men whose words could cut through his self-doubt. With a quiet conviction, his grandfather handed him a sentence that would guide his every decision. Charles, if God tells you to run through a brick wall, you run. He'll make the hole. It was a turning point. From that moment, Charles stopped questioning and started following. He embraced a principle that would define his legacy: obedience to God, no matter the risk. In the 1950s, Stanley dove into formal studies at the University of Richmond and later Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. But he wasn't there just to memorize verses. He was learning how to turn Scripture into oxygen for those suffocating in silence. His first church in a quiet North Carolina town wasn't flashy, just 150 members. But impact isn't measured in crowd size. He was changing lives, one sermon at a time. By the age of 26, Charles had already been ordained, a bold milestone in a profession where many waited longer to take the pulpit. He moved from Miami to Ohio to Bartow, delivering sermons that helped people navigate life in uncertain times. He offered hope during the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis and stood with military families during the uncertainty of the Cold War. Each church brought fresh battles, but also refined his purpose, chiseling away fear and sharpening his resolve. Then came Atlanta, a city that would define his journey, but not without cost. In 1969, he stepped into the First Baptist Church of Atlanta as an associate pastor. What he found was a community not united by faith, but fractured by politics and personal rivalries. Meetings often devolved into shouting matches. Tensions escalated so severely that during one confrontation, someone struck him. But Charles didn't walk away. He stayed. He endured the silent judgments, the whispered betrayals, the open resistance. Week after week, he showed up, preaching not just with Scripture, but with presence. For 2 long years, he stood at the edge of a storm, facing opposition from those who didn't believe he belonged. And yet, he refused to break. Then came October 1st, 1971, a date that changed everything. The congregation voted, and against the odds, at just 39 years old, Charles Stanley was named senior pastor of one of the most influential churches in the South. He hadn't just survived, He had taken the reins of a spiritual powerhouse. But it wasn't just a title. It was a platform, a battlefield, a promise fulfilled. For a man who once hid in church basements and prayed through the night, this moment was more than victory. It was vindication. He had obeyed, and the consequences had aligned. Behind every iconic figure lies a hidden history of struggle and grit. And Charles Stanley's rise wasn't paved in comfort. It was forged in fire and tested by silence. But through every setback, he moved forward with a fierce kind of grace, anchored by faith, fueled by scars, and determined to lead others toward the very peace he once fought to find. Charles Stanley wasn't interested in waiting around. Just a year after becoming senior pastor, in 1972, he rolled the dice on something modest but deeply personal. He launched a local television program called The Chapel Hour. No flashing lights, no fancy sets, just a camera, a Bible, and 30 minutes of heartfelt teaching. Yet something about it clicked. The simplicity cut through the noise. And then, like wildfire, it spread. Christian Broadcasting Network caught wind. Satellites began to carry the signal. And in a matter of days, his small Atlanta broadcast exploded into a national phenomenon. Viewers across the country suddenly found themselves in touch with Dr. Charles Stanley. But even as his message crossed oceans and languages, Charles's personal world was quietly falling apart. At home, things were unraveling. His wife, Anna, had spent decades watching her husband pour his energy into ministry while she stood in the shadows. It wasn't bitterness, it was heartbreak. To her, the message was loud and clear. She was always going to come second. Years of distance finally took their toll. She once confessed, with a quiet clarity, "He made his choices. I just wasn't one of them." The collapse of their marriage wasn't loud, but it was steady. In 1993, Anna filed for divorce. Then, with a glimmer of hope, she withdrew it, perhaps believing reconciliation was still possible. But by 2000, the divorce was finalized. Charles was 67, his sermons reaching audiences in more than 50 languages. He had built a global ministry, yet, within his home, it was silent, empty. That kind of personal loss, coming at the peak of professional triumph, cut deep. The news of the divorce sent shockwaves through the evangelical world. This was the same man who'd spent his career preaching about family, commitment, and spiritual leadership. And now, he was standing in front of the world, no longer married. Many in the church saw it as a betrayal. Leaders pushed for him to resign. After all, years earlier, Charles had told his congregation that if he ever divorced, he'd step down. Now, that moment had arrived, and yet, he didn't move. Standing firm at the pulpit, he addressed the congregation not with excuses, but with quiet conviction. "God has assured me I am still where He wants me to be." What happened next stunned everyone. The congregation backed him, overwhelmingly. But one voice didn't echo the same support: his son, Andy. For years, it was assumed that Andy Stanley would inherit the legacy, continue in his father's footsteps, and eventually lead the church Charles had built. But that narrative took a dramatic turn. Andy didn't just walk away from First Baptist. He carved out an entirely new path. He launched North Point Community Church, a place that embraced a vastly different tone and structure. It wasn't just a new church, it was a new direction. One that, at the time, seemed to reject everything Charles stood for. By the end of North Point's first year, over 4,000 people filled its seats. The growth was explosive. Andy's style, casual, modern, emotionally transparent, struck a chord with a new generation. Today, it reaches more than 43,000 members. But for years, despite preaching messages of grace and unity, father and son shared no words. Their silence spoke volumes. Across Christian communities, speculation ran wild. Was it the divorce? Theology? Pride? Whatever the cause, the irony was sharp. Two men of God, both champions of forgiveness, couldn't seem to forgive each other. Eventually, something shifted. They agreed to counseling. And in one raw session, Andy asked the question that had weighed on him for years: "When do I stop trying with my dad?" The counselor responded with a single unforgettable line: "When your heavenly Father stops trying with you." That moment hit like thunder. It wasn't a solution, but it was the start of something. It cracked the emotional wall between them. The breakthrough didn't come in a sermon or a church boardroom. It came during a quiet lunch. Charles looked across the table and, with no cameras or congregation watching, simply said, "I don't want us to be like other fathers and sons." Andy, without hesitation, responded, "Me neither, Dad." That short exchange held decades of weight. That was the day the healing began. By 2013, Andy's church had grown into a spiritual force. Tens of thousands now followed his sermons. But the real story wasn't on stage. It was in a father's pride. At his own pulpit, Charles publicly celebrated his son, his voice steady, his eyes bright. He didn't gloss over the past. He didn't pretend the wounds were gone. But he chose to honor him anyway. And in private, he admitted how hard it was to get there. The pain still lived in him, but pride, love, and grace lived there too. For decades, Charles Stanley had preached obedience to God, no matter the cost. But now, in this chapter, he was learning something just as powerful, that grace isn't just a sermon you deliver, it's something you live. And sometimes, the greatest act of faith isn't standing behind a pulpit, it's sitting across from your son and choosing to begin again. Something shifted the moment silence gave way to grace. For years, Charles Stanley and Andy Stanley walked separate roads, preaching from different pulpits in different styles, to different crowds. But near the end, those roads curved inward, intersecting not in theology, but in understanding. The rebel son became a companion. The stern father became a quiet cheerleader. They began visiting one another's churches, small gestures, massive weight. A fractured story was being rewritten in real time, not by sermons, but by moments of stillness. Charles spent most of his final days in a worn leather chair, his throne, his sanctuary. His hands, once steady behind a pulpit, now trembled slightly as they rested in his lap. But his eyes were sharp, soul alert, and his heart still carried the weight of decades. Andy visited often, never with grandeur, just presence. He would kneel beside the chair, not as a pastor, not even as a son, but as a listener. They didn't talk about legacy. They didn't discuss numbers. They shared silence, prayer, and glimmers of peace that had taken years to find. And then came one unexpected evening, April 15th, 2023. A Saturday that began like so many others, quiet, reflective. Andy had stopped by to pray, to sit in familiar rhythm. But as he rose to leave, Charles stopped him with a simple question. "Can I pray for you?" Andy froze. In all their years, his father had never offered that. Never once. Andy knelt, and Charles, frail, humbled, full of clarity, placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder and whispered something that decades of sermons couldn't match. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." It wasn't scripted. It wasn't part of a lesson. It was a father, breaking open his soul in 7 words, words that somehow rewrote everything. 3 days later, the world lost Charles Stanley. At 7:30 a.m. on April 18th, he passed peacefully. 90 years of breath, over half a century of ministry, and more than 66 years of sermons came to an end. Not with fanfare, but with grace. His voice, which had echoed in over 114 languages across continents, went silent. But what he built didn't fade. In Touch Ministries still airs today, still offering light to the lost, comfort to the searching. His daughter Becky, though mostly private, carried a quiet strength. She had lived through it all, the highs of her father's rising influence, the silent toll it took on their family, the collapse and rebuilding. Her words weren't loud, but her presence was everything. She represented the family that stayed, even through the storms. Charles Stanley was never a perfect man. That's what made his story human. He preached about forgiveness while wrestling with wounds that wouldn't close. He taught about families while losing hold of his own. He was raised in fear, and that fear shaped him, but never controlled him. He was difficult, uncompromising, often infuriating in his certainty, and yet he inspired millions. Because behind every sermon was a man still trying to find peace within himself. He didn't remarry, never sought romance again. He stayed laser-focused on the mission. Even after the divorce, even after public fallout, he never abandoned his calling. That calling wasn't just about converting hearts. It was about showing people that faith doesn't mean perfection. It means endurance. And perhaps that's why his final act, reconciling with his son, was his greatest ministry. It wasn't broadcast. It wasn't choreographed. It was raw, real. A reminder that sometimes the loudest gospel isn't the one shouted from the stage. It's the one whispered at home, too late, but not too late to matter. Financially, Charles Stanley led a surprisingly disciplined lifestyle despite his global reach. He wasn't one to chase glitz, but his wealth was substantial. Over the decades, through his books, television royalties, and speaking engagements, his net worth reportedly reached between $1.50 to $2 million. He owned a modest collection of luxury vehicles, including a Lexus LS and a fully equipped Mercedes S-Class, both chosen more for comfort than status. He wore classic, understated timepieces like the Omega Constellation and a vintage Rolex Datejust, symbols of quiet elegance. His primary residence in Atlanta was spacious but not flashy, reflecting his preference for privacy over prestige. While he didn't own a private jet, he frequently traveled first class during ministry tours, often chartered by In Touch Ministries. He was also known for having comprehensive insurance coverage, health policies, long-term disability insurance, and asset protection for ministry-related travel and equipment. His biggest investment, however, was always in media. He poured resources into satellite broadcasting and digital platforms to expand his ministry's reach. And unlike many in his position, he stayed away from high-risk ventures, choosing legacy over leverage. The financial lesson his journey leaves behind: build slow, stay grounded, and never confuse your platform with your purpose. Charles didn't buy his influence. He earned it sermon by sermon, prayer by prayer. His greatest currency was trust. And in a world built on spectacle, that's priceless. In the end, Charles Stanley's story wasn't about the man in the suit or the crowd before the camera. It was about the fractured boy who learned how to stand again. It was about a son who found his voice, and a father who in his final days found the courage to say what truly mattered. And those words, "I couldn't be prouder of you," weren't just for Andy. They echoed through the thousands who tuned in each Sunday, through every strained relationship, every silent dinner, every family split by pride and time. Because somewhere in those final breaths, Charles Stanley gave us his clearest sermon yet, not from a pulpit, but from a chair, hands trembling, eyes steady, heart open. And maybe, just maybe, that was the message we all needed to hear. And there you have it, an extraordinary journey through the life of Charles Stanley. From the pain of a broken childhood to the heights of spiritual leadership, from silence between a father and son to the most powerful words ever spoken in a whisper, this story wasn't just about sermons, pulpits, or broadcasts. It was about resilience, about healing, and about how the quietest moments often speak the loudest truths. Charles Stanley didn't just build a ministry, he built a global legacy. He preached in over 114 languages, led a congregation for 5 decades, and reached millions without ever seeking the spotlight for himself. And yet, his final message, the one that stuck with us, wasn't delivered from a stage. It was spoken gently to his son when no cameras were rolling. That's what makes this story unforgettable. What hits hardest is that Charles was never just a preacher. He was a man learning to forgive, to connect, and to hold tight to what really matters. For every follower inspired by his words, there was a man behind the message, pushing through pain, confronting family fractures, and proving that even decades of silence can be rewritten with just one heartfelt sentence. If this journey moved you, if you felt something stir while hearing Charles's story unfold, then go ahead and tap that like button. Drop us a comment. Maybe share your favorite Charles Stanley moment, a sermon that changed your perspective, or a family moment that mirrors his story.